marry the first man who enters," she joked. Then the Korean Mafia boss walked in. The last thing Hannah Seo expected when she opened her mouth that Thursday night was for fate to actually be listening. But fate, it turned out, had been parked outside Café Myri for 4 years, patient, unhurried, and completely unbothered by the rain, waiting for one reckless woman to say exactly the wrong thing at exactly the right moment. What happens when your most reckless joke becomes your actual life? Stick around, because Hannah's about to find out the hard way. Like, share, and subscribe. This story is funny, dark, and completely unhinged. You've been warned. The blind date canceled at 7:42 p.m. Not with a phone call. Not with an explanation that required any actual courage or creativity. Just a text. 9 words. Something came up. Really sorry. We'll reschedule soon. Hannah read it twice, set her phone face down on the cafe table with the careful precision of someone defusing a bomb made entirely of humiliation, and then picked up her wine glass and finished it in one smooth, dignified motion that was neither smooth nor particularly dignified. "He canceled," she announced. Yujin, her oldest friend and the only person on earth who could make sympathy look like entertainment, pressed her lips together. Sorry, her other oldest friend and the only person who could make entertainment look like sympathy, immediately refilled Hannah's glass. "How many is that now?" Yujin asked. "This year or total?" "This year." Hannah considered this, with the gravity of someone reviewing a very disappointing financial report.
4.
5 if you count the one who technically showed up but spent the whole dinner texting someone else and called it multitasking. "That's not multitasking," Sori said. "That's just being rude with extra steps." Outside, the rain against the cafe windows had graduated from polite background noise to something more insistent, the kind of rain that makes you feel like the weather is personally invested in your misery. Café Myri was warm and amberlit, smelling of espresso and toasted bread, the kind of place designed to make ordinary evenings feel significant. It was, Hannah had always thought, wasted on her. She had been coming here for 3 years and had never once experienced a significant evening. Mostly she experienced moderate inconvenience and above-average coffee. "The problem," Yujin said, with the authority of someone who had delivered this diagnosis before, "is your standards." "My standards are perfectly reasonable." You told the last one his career goals lacked philosophical coherence. They did. He was a dentist, Hannah. And dentistry can be philosophically coherent. He just hadn't thought about it. She took a sip of wine. That's the problem. Nobody thinks about anything. This was not entirely true, but it was the kind of sweeping declaration that felt accurate after 2 glasses and a canceled date, and her friends had long since learned to let these moments breathe rather than challenge them with facts. The rain intensified. Hannah looked at the cafe door. She was not sure what she was looking for, certainly not another blind date, certainly not a sign, certainly not anything requiring further emotional investment from an account that was, at this point, significantly overdrawn. She was looking the way people look at doors when what they really mean is, "I would very much like my life to be different, but I don't know how to ask for that without sounding dramatic." "You know what?" she said. "Forget men." "Here we go," Sori murmured. "I mean it. Forget all of it.
The apps.
The setups. The whole exhausting production of it." She lifted her glass. "I'll just marry the first man who walks through that door." Yujin laughed so hard she choked on her straw. Sori made the solemn toast of someone witnessing a very small, very stupid ceremony. They clinked glasses. The wine was warm. The rain outside seemed, briefly, to applaud. Nobody thought to check who was standing just outside the door. The bell above the entrance chimed. And the room changed. It didn't change dramatically. No gasp, no music, no cinematic gust of wind. It changed the way a room changes when something enters it that doesn't belong to the ordinary world of blind dates and canceled texts and philosophical dentists. Conversations didn't stop. They just softened, like a radio turned down 2 notches by an invisible hand. The man who walked in wore a black suit with no tie, and the kind of stillness that most people spend their entire lives trying to perform and never quite achieve. He didn't look around for a seat. He didn't check his phone. He simply entered, and the room rearranged itself quietly around him the way water moves around a stone, not because it has to, but because the stone has decided where it stands. Behind him, two men stepped briefly into the doorway before positioning themselves near the entrance. Not menacing, not theatrical, just present, the way walls are present, structurally and without apology. Hannah's smile faded. She did not know his name. She did not know his history. She did not know about the 4 legitimate businesses, or the 2 illegitimate empires, or the journalist who now had strong feelings about mackerel. She knew nothing except what the air in the room was telling her, and the air was telling her, in no uncertain terms, that this man operated on a frequency that ordinary life did not broadcast on. Hannah, Sori said, very quietly, her hand finding Hannah's arm under the table. That's him. The wine glass was still raised. The toast was still technically in progress. And the first man through the door was already walking toward the counter, ordering black coffee with no sugar, and, in a development that Hannah's nervous system was struggling to process, looking directly at her table. Not at the table. At her. Her friends were not breathing. The barista had forgotten what he was doing. The rain hit the windows like it was trying to get in. And somewhere in the reasonable, sensible, self-preserving corner of Hannah Sio's mind, a small voice said, "You should have checked who was outside before you opened your mouth." She had not checked. She never did. The business card sat on the table for 6 minutes before anyone spoke. Hannah knew it was 6 minutes because she watched the clock above the counter with the focused intensity of someone waiting for a bomb disposal expert who was, unfortunately, not coming. The card was cream-colored.
Thick.
The kind of cardstock that costs more per sheet than Hannah's hourly freelance rate, which was already a number she tried not to think about before noon. There was a name, Kong Jae-ho, and a single phone number. No title. No company. No cheerful tagline about customer satisfaction. Men who needed titles on their business cards, she supposed, were men who needed people to know who they were. This man did not have that problem. "Okay," Yujin said finally, in the voice she reserved for situations that had exceeded her emotional processing capacity. "Okay. That's all you have?"
Sori asked.
"I need a moment. You've had 6 minutes. I need several more." Hannah had not moved. The wine glass was still in her hand, technically, though it had been empty for the last 4 of those 6 minutes, and she was simply holding it the way people hold things when they need something to do with their hands that isn't picking up a business card left by the Korean underworld's least photographed executive. "He heard me," she said. "Yes," Sori confirmed. "He actually walked over." "Also yes." And said, she stopped. Replayed it. The low, unhurried voice. The complete absence of performance in it. "I believe you made a promise." Like he was referencing a contract. Like she had signed something in triplicate and the copy had been notarized. "He said I made a promise." To be fair, Yujin offered carefully. "You did say it." Hannah turned to look at her with an expression that could have stripped paint. "To be fair," Yujin amended, "a joke is not a promise and you are completely right, and he is a terrifying man." "Thank you. But he's also, don't. I was going to say, punctual." Sori made a sound that was either a laugh or a cough, wisely undecided. Hannah set the wine glass down. She looked at the card. The card looked back at her with the quiet confidence of an object that knew it was going to win. She thought about the way he had crossed the cafe, not quickly, not slowly, not like a man trying to make an impression, but like a man who had simply decided to move and expected the physical world to accommodate that decision. She thought about the faint amusement that had crossed his face when she pushed back. Not surprise. Not irritation. Amusement. Like she was the most interesting thing that had happened to him in a while, which said either very flattering things about her or very alarming things about his daily life, and she suspected strongly it was the latter. She thought about his eyes.
Calm. Still.
The kind of eyes that belong to people who have already considered every possible outcome of every possible situation and are simply waiting for events to confirm their calculations. She did not pick up the card. She went home at 10:15, leaving it on the table. She came back for it at 10:23. The barista, to his eternal credit, had not thrown it away. He handed it to her without a word, with the careful neutrality of a man who had decided that whatever was happening was above his pay grade and intended to keep it that way. Hannah thanked him, tucked the card into her jacket pocket, and walked home in the rain, telling herself she was only keeping it as a precaution. Evidence, perhaps. A conversation piece. A very expensive-looking reminder to keep her mouth closed in public spaces. She was not going to call it. She was absolutely, definitively, under no circumstances going to call that number. She called it at 11:30. In her defense, and she spent considerable time constructing this defense in the 45 minutes between arriving home and dialing, she had a legitimate reason. She needed to clarify. She needed to establish, calmly and professionally, that she was a normal person who said foolish things sometimes and that no legal or social framework supported the enforcement of a joke made over wine to an audience of 2 friends and a rain-streaked window. This was a reasonable phone call made by a reasonable adult. He answered on the second ring. "I need to explain something," she said, without saying hello, because hello felt too small for the occasion. "Go ahead."
His voice was the same. Of course it was the same.
It was the kind of voice that didn't change based on context, because its context was apparently everywhere and always.
She explained.
She was good at explaining. It was one of the few places where her inability to stop talking worked in her favor. She deployed logic. She used analogies. There was one about weather forecasting that she felt was particularly strong. She talked for 4 minutes and 12 seconds and covered social contracts, the nature of humor, the legal non-binding status of statements made under mild intoxication, and a brief philosophical tangent about intent versus interpretation that she privately considered her best work. He was quiet for a moment when she finished.
"Dinner," he said.
"Friday. I'll send a car." She stared at her kitchen wall. "Did you hear anything I just said?" "All of it." "And you called me," he said, "at 11:30. The line between them hummed with the specific silence of a person realizing they have, once again, said exactly the wrong thing at exactly the wrong time. Except this time, the wrong thing was an entire phone call, and the wrong time was apparently her whole life. From the kitchen doorway, Eugen, who had come over after the cafe and was now eating Hannah's leftover rice with zero shame, watched her friend's face cycle through 6 distinct emotional phases in approximately 4 seconds and later described it as the most efficient breakdown she had ever witnessed. Hannah hung up, looked at the card, looked at Eugen. "He's sending a car on Friday," she said. Eugen pointed her chopsticks solemnly. "I told you to leave the card." Friday arrived the way all dreaded things arrive. Too quickly, without adequate warning, and dressed better than expected. Hannah spent the preceding 48 hours oscillating between 2 positions. The first position was that she would simply not be home on Friday. She would be elsewhere. Anywhere. She would develop a sudden and convincing interest in hiking, or visit a relative in a city far enough away to constitute a reasonable excuse, or simply cease to exist as a locatable person until the situation resolved itself through natural entropy. This was the sensible position. This was the position endorsed by every functional instinct she possessed. The second position was that she had already said yes. She had not, technically, said yes. She had hung up. But she had not said no either, and with a man like Jeho, she was increasingly certain that silence was not interpreted as refusal. Silence, in his vocabulary, was probably just confirmation delivered quietly. She told Sori about the dilemma on Thursday morning. Sori listened carefully, nodded once, and said, "Wear the black dress." "That is not advice about whether I should go." "No," Sori agreed. "It's advice about what to wear when you do." Eugen's contribution was more nuanced and significantly less helpful. She arrived at Hannah's apartment Thursday evening with a printed document, actual paper, printed from an actual printer, which meant she had planned this, titled "Reasons This is a Terrible Idea" in bold at the top, followed by a numbered list of 14 points, several of which cited historical precedent and one of which included a footnote. Hannah read it twice, acknowledged that all 14 points were valid, and asked Eugen if she could borrow her pearl earrings for Friday. Eugen left the document on the kitchen table where it remained, technically unrefuted. The car arrived at 7. Not a regular car. Of course, not a regular car. It was the kind of vehicle that made other cars feel self-conscious about their life choices. Black, long, immaculate, with a driver who held the door open with the practiced calm of a man who had never once wondered whether any of this was normal. Hannah's neighbor, Mr. Beck, who was 71 and spent most evenings watering a plant on his balcony that had been dead for 2 years, looked down at the street and then looked at Hannah with an expression she couldn't quite read. She gave him a small wave. He watered the dead plant with renewed purpose and went inside. The restaurant was not what she expected, which meant she wasn't sure what she had expected. Something deliberately intimidating, perhaps. Somewhere designed to make her feel small. Instead, it was quiet, understated. The kind of place that didn't advertise its exclusivity because it didn't need to, the way genuinely wealthy people don't wear logos. 6 tables, each separated by enough distance to make conversation completely private. Lighting that was warm without trying. A menu with no prices, which either meant everything was included or everything was so expensive that printing the numbers was considered a form of aggression. Jae-ho was already seated. He stood when she approached, not with the theatrical flourish of a man performing good manners, but with the simple economy of someone for whom it was automatic. He was in dark navy tonight instead of black, which meant nothing, probably, and yet Hannah's brain filed it anyway like a researcher cataloging a new data point. "You came," he said. "Your car is very persuasive," she replied. The faintest suggestion of a smile. She was beginning to recognize these. They were small, almost imperceptible, like fault lines you could only see if you were paying close attention. She was, against her better judgment, paying very close attention. They sat. The first 20 minutes were, against all reasonable expectation, not terrible. He asked about her work. She was a freelance content strategist, which she explained, and he listened to without the glazed expression most people produced when she described it. He asked specific follow-up questions. Not polite questions. "Oh, how interesting," and "Do you enjoy it?" but actual questions, the kind that indicated he had processed what she said and wanted more information rather than just demonstrating that he had been technically present during her answer. It was, she thought, profoundly unsettling. She had prepared for intimidation. She had not prepared for attentiveness. "You're not what I expected," she said, somewhere between the first course and the second. "What did you expect?" "Someone who talks more about himself." "I know enough about myself," he said. "You're more interesting." She picked up her water glass to have something to do with her hands. That's either a very smooth line or a genuinely alarming statement from a man in your position. Which position is that? The one where people apparently relocate to fishing villages after writing about you. He looked at her for a moment. Then, and this was the thing she would turn over in her mind for days afterward, he laughed. Not loudly. Not with the performed warmth of a man trying to seem approachable. A real laugh, brief and unguarded, the kind that escapes before a person can decide whether to allow it. It changed his face entirely. For approximately 3 seconds, he looked like someone who had not yet decided to become whoever he currently was. Someone younger, less constructed, less surrounded by men who stood near doorways. Then it was gone, and he was composed again, and Hannah was left with the distinct and inconvenient feeling of someone who has glimpsed something they were not supposed to see and cannot now unsee it. The journalist, he said, had an unfortunate habit of printing things he couldn't verify. And the fishing village? Was his own choice. I understand he's quite happy. I'm sure you had nothing to do with that happiness. I prefer, he said, when people find their own path. The second course arrived. Outside, Seoul's nighttime pressed against the windows. The restaurant hummed with the low music of a room full of people pretending not to notice who was at which table, and Hannah sat across from a man who controlled enough of the city's underground to make mayors nervous, eating the best meal she had consumed in 3 years, and thought, this is how it starts, isn't it? Not with fear. Not with drama. With a dinner where someone actually listens to you, and a laugh you were not supposed to witness, and the slow, creeping, entirely inconvenient realization that the most dangerous thing in the room is not the man across from you. It's the fact that you're not afraid of him. Has someone ever surprised you so completely that it scared you more than the alternative? Drop it in the comments, because Hannah's about to find out that being unafraid of the wrong person is its own kind of danger. And if you think Jae-ho is playing a longer game than Hannah realizes, hit like. Only people siding with the uncle won't. The uncle's name was Kyol-soo, and he was, by any measurable standard, a man who had spent his entire life making excellent problems for other people. He was 53 years old, chronically optimistic about his own judgment despite an unbroken record of evidence to the contrary, and possessed of the specific kind of charm that works beautifully on first impressions and catastrophically on every impression after that. He had borrowed money from people who didn't lend money, made promises to people who collected promises like debts, and navigated 40 years of poor decisions with the buoyancy of a man who genuinely believed that the next thing would be the thing that worked out. The next thing never worked out. Hannah had not spoken to him in 4 years. The falling out had been quiet rather than dramatic. No screaming, no confrontation, just the slow withdrawal of someone who had finally done the math on a relationship and found the numbers consistently didn't balance. Kyol-soo borrowed.
Kyol-soo charmed.
Kyol-soo disappeared when the bill arrived and reappeared when the next opportunity presented itself, wearing his optimism like a freshly pressed shirt over the same tired bones. She had wished him well, in the abstract way you wish, well, to a weather pattern you've decided to stop standing in and moved on. She had not known about the debt. She found out on a Saturday morning, 11 days after the dinner, in the least convenient way possible, which was consistent with how most things in her life arrived, because the universe had apparently decided early on that Hannah Seo was someone who could handle inconvenience, and had been testing this theory aggressively ever since. She was at her desk, working on a campaign brief for a skincare client whose primary request was that the copy feel authentic but also luxurious but also relatable but also aspirational, which was not a brief so much as a personality disorder, when her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. "Is this Hannah?" The voice was male, middle-aged, carrying the careful neutrality of someone delivering information rather than initiating conversation. "Depends on who's asking. My name is Taesung. I work for Kong Jae-ho." She set down her pen. "Okay. Mr. Kong wanted you to have some information. He felt you should hear it before." A pause. Deliberate. Before things progressed further. This was, she would later reflect, either the most considerate thing a man in Jae-ho's position had ever done or the most strategically intelligent, and she was not yet equipped to determine which. Perhaps both. Perhaps in his world, consideration and strategy had long since merged into a single practice, indistinguishable from each other the way rivers merge and lose their individual names. Taesung explained it plainly. For years ago, a man named Kyol-soo had come to Jae-ho's organization with a proposal. The proposal was bad. Most of Kyol-soo's proposals were bad. This was, by that point, a documented pattern. But Kyol-soo was persuasive in the way that only truly delusional optimists can be persuasive, because they believe so completely in what they're saying that the belief itself becomes temporarily contagious. The organization had passed on the proposal, but extended a different kind of arrangement. Assistance, in exchange for a favor to be named later. Kyol-soo, with the breezy confidence of a man signing a contract he hadn't read, agreed. The favor he offered as collateral was a name. Hannah's name. Not as a threat. Not as anything sinister. Taesung was careful to clarify. The organization did not traffic in people, and Jae-ho was not that kind of man, whatever kind of man he was. The name was offered as an introduction. A connection. Someone capable, trustworthy, useful in the legitimate architecture of Jae-ho's above-ground business interests, which were considerable and required people who could actually think. Kyol-soo had described his niece with the one reliable skill he possessed. He was, when the subject was someone else's virtues, an excellent salesman. Jae-ho had filed the name away. For years past. And then his associate confirmed that a certain cafe owner in the district owed a debt, and the cafe owner's name was Kyol-soo, and Jae-ho looked at the name and thought about the file he had kept and decided to collect 2 things that evening instead of 1. He had known, before he pushed open the cafe door, exactly who would be sitting inside. Hannah sat with the phone against her ear for a long moment after Taesung finished.
"He knew," she said.
Not a question. Yes. The coffee. The card. All of it. Mr. Kong felt. He felt what, exactly? Another pause. She got the impression Taesung was a man who chose words the way surgeons chose instruments, carefully, with awareness of consequence. He felt that if something was going to develop, it should develop honestly, without you operating on incomplete information. She hung up. Then she sat very still at her desk for approximately 4 minutes, which was, coincidentally, the same amount of time she had spent explaining herself to Jae-ho on the phone 11 days earlier. She found a grim symmetry in this that she did not appreciate. Then she picked up her keys. Kyeolsu lived 20 minutes away in an apartment that looked exactly like the home of a man who had never quite committed to any version of his own life. Half-furnished, optimistically cluttered, smelling of instant noodles and postponed consequences. He opened the door in a house robe and the expression of a man who had been expecting this visit for 4 years and had still somehow not prepared for it. "Hannah, you sold my name," she said. "It wasn't like, to the Korean Mafia. That's a very reductive way to, Kyeolsu." Her voice was quiet. This was, her mother had always said, when Hannah was most dangerous, not when she was loud, but when she went quiet, like a city going dark before a storm. "Tell me exactly what you did. From the beginning. Leave nothing out. And understand that I am standing here instead of somewhere else, which means I have chosen to hear your side, and that is the last generous thing I intend to do today." He told her. It took 40 minutes and 2 cups of tea she didn't drink and 1 moment where Kyeolsu attempted to characterize what he'd done as networking, at which point Hannah looked at him with an expression that caused him to immediately and permanently abandon that particular framing. When he finished, she stood. "You don't get to be in my life," she said. "Not because I hate you. Because you are expensive in ways that have nothing to do with money, and I am done paying." She left. In the elevator down, she stared at her own reflection in the mirrored doors, hair slightly disheveled from the walk, jaw set, eyes dry because she had cried about Kyeolsu a long time ago and had no more of that particular currency to spend on him. What she felt now was not hurt. It was clarity. Jae-ho had known. He had walked in deliberately. He had set the card down deliberately. And this was the part she kept returning to, turning it over like a stone to see what lived underneath, he had told her. Through Taesung, yes, with the careful distance of a man who understood that some conversations required intermediaries. But he had told her. Before things progressed further, she pulled out her phone, found his number, not Taesung's, his, and typed a single message. "We need to talk." The reply came in under a minute. "Tomorrow. 8. I'll send the car." She looked at the message. Looked at her reflection again. Somewhere below, Seoul moved through its Saturday with complete indifference to the fact that Hannah Seo's life had once again tilted off its axis, except this time, she noticed, she was not falling. She was recalibrating. There was a difference. It was small, but it was hers, and she intended to keep it. The car arrived at 7:58. Hannah noticed this, not at 8, not at 8:02 with a casual approximation of someone for whom punctuality was a suggestion, but 7:58, which meant the driver had calculated her building's elevator time, her lobby crossing time, and the precise number of seconds a person needs between leaving an apartment and being psychologically ready to enter a vehicle, and had accounted for all of it. This was either impressive or unnerving, and Hannah had spent enough time in Jae-ho's orbit now to understand that in his world, those two things were frequently the same thing, wearing different shoes. She had spent Sunday preparing. Not in the way she had prepared for the first dinner. That had been reactive preparation, the frantic energy of someone dressing for a situation they hadn't chosen. This was different. This was deliberate. She had sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea that went cold while she thought, which was how she did her best thinking, surrounded by the evidence of an interrupted life, the skincare brief still open on her laptop, Eugen's 14-point document still on the table, her own reflection occasionally visible in the dark window across the room like a second opinion she hadn't asked for. She had made a list. Not of grievances, she was done with those, had folded them up and left them at Kyeolsu's apartment along with the undrunk tea. A list of questions. Specific, direct, unapologetic questions that deserved specific, direct, unapologetic answers. She had written them in order of importance and then reordered them twice and then decided the order didn't matter because she was going to ask all of them regardless. She brought the list. He was waiting at the same restaurant. Same table. He stood when she approached, same as before, and she noticed the gesture differently now, not as performance, but as habit, which meant it was genuine, which was somehow more disarming than if it had been calculated.
She sat down.
Put the list on the table between them, face up, without preamble. He looked at it, then at her. You made notes, he said. I'm a content strategist. I make notes about everything. She folded her hands. Question 1. You knew who I was before you walked into that cafe? Yes. You had my name in a file for 4 years? Yes. And you chose that evening specifically because my uncle's debt gave you a reason to be there?
A pause.
Not evasion. She was learning to read his pauses, the way you learn to read weather, by paying attention to what comes before and after. The debt was a separate matter. Your uncle and I had an outstanding arrangement. The timing was another pause. Convenient. Convenient, she repeated. Is that the word you're using? It's the accurate word. Accurate, she said, is doing a lot of work in that sentence. He looked at her steadily. What word would you prefer? Orchestrated. That implies more planning than was involved. Then explain the actual amount of planning that was involved. He was quiet for a moment, and she had the impression of a man deciding not whether to answer but how much of the answer to give. Not from dishonesty, but from the habit of someone who had spent years in an environment where full disclosure was a liability. He was recalibrating, she realized. For her. In real time. I knew your name, he said finally. Your uncle spoke about you specifically, your work, your mind, the way you handled problems. I noted it because people worth noting are not common. He paused. When the cafe situation arose, I was aware you might be present. I did not engineer the joke. I did not engineer your friends, or the canceled date, or the wine. The faintest suggestion of something crossed his expression. Those were entirely your own. How generous of fate, she said dryly. What I engineered, he continued, was being there and approaching you when the opportunity presented itself. That part was deliberate. She looked at him. The restaurant hummed quietly around them. Why tell me? You could have let me keep thinking it was coincidence. Because, he said, with the simple directness of a man who had apparently decided that this, at least, required no careful packaging, I don't want you operating in my world without accurate information. It isn't fair to you. The word fair landed unexpectedly. It was not a word she had associated with his world, a world that, by most accounts, operated on leverage and calculation and the quiet rearrangement of outcomes. Fair was a word from a different vocabulary entirely. Your world, she said slowly, is not a place I agreed to enter. No, he said. But you're in it. He didn't say this with satisfaction or a threat, just as a statement of geography. You're here. The question is what you want to do about that. She looked at her list. Question 4. What exactly do you want from me? Was suddenly the most important one, and she had been circling toward it since she sat down. Question 4, she said. He waited. What do you actually want? Not from my uncle's arrangement. Not from whatever file you kept. From me. Specifically. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of a man taking a question seriously rather than reaching for the nearest available answer. I want, he said, what I told you in the cafe. What you offered, even if you didn't mean it. I was joking. I know. He met her eyes. I want it anyway. She sat back. That is either the most arrogant thing anyone has ever said to me, or the most honest. In my experience, he said quietly, those are often the same thing. She looked at him for a long moment, at the composed face and the still hands and the carefully constructed exterior of a man who had just, with 4 words, I want it anyway, shown her more of his interior than she suspected most people ever saw. The file, she realized, had not been about acquisition. It had been about attention. Jeho, who found most people exhausting and mediocre, had heard about a woman who told her company director his strategy was panic wearing a tie and had thought, interesting. had kept thinking it for 4 years, quietly, the way people keep thinking about things they don't yet have a context for.
She was the context.
This was objectively insane. She picked up her list, folded it once, put it in her bag. I have 3 more questions, she said. Ask them. Not tonight. She picked up the menu, the one with no prices, the one that was essentially an act of aggression, and looked at it with the composure of a woman who had decided something without yet deciding to say so. Tonight, I want to eat something that costs more than my rent, and talk about something that isn't my uncle or your files, or the word convenient. He looked at her with an expression she was cataloging as new, something that hadn't appeared at the first dinner or in the cafe, or in any of the small interactions she had been carefully, involuntarily, collecting. Something that looked almost like relief. What do you want to talk about? He asked. Tell me something true, she said. Not strategic. Not managed. Something you'd only say to someone you actually trust. The pause this time was longer. She let it breathe. I haven't slept well, he said finally, in about 6 years. She looked up from the menu. The kind of life I run, he said, doesn't turn off. There's always something unresolved. Something requiring a decision. He looked at the table briefly, then back at her, and she had the vertiginous sense of a curtain being drawn back on something vast and unexpectedly human. The night after the cafe, after you called, I slept for 7 hours. I don't know what to do with that information. Hannah set the menu down. She thought about her own sleepless freelance nights, the skincare briefs and the canceled dates and the wine and the reckless jokes made to rain-streaked windows. She thought about 2 people on entirely opposite ends of whatever spectrum life operated on, lying awake in their respective darkness for entirely different reasons. I know what to do with it, she said. He waited. Nothing yet, she said. But I know what it means. She picked the menu back up. He, for the first time since she had met him, looked like a man who didn't already know what happened next. She found, to her own considerable surprise, that she liked him better this way. The thing about Kiyosu was that he never stayed solved. Hannah had known this, theoretically, the way you know that certain structural problems in old buildings don't disappear when you stop looking at them. They simply continue their quiet work behind the walls, expanding slowly, waiting for the moment when the weight becomes too much and the ceiling makes its feelings known. She had walked out of his apartment with the clean, deliberate energy of a woman who had closed a chapter, and she had meant it, and for 17 days it had been true. Then Kiyosu called Jae-ho directly. She found out the way she found out most things involving her uncle, sideways, from a direction she hadn't been watching. Taesung called on a Wednesday afternoon while she was on a client call, and she had to hold the information in her mind like something hot while she finished discussing content calendars with a woman who wanted her brand voice to feel simultaneously edgy and maternal, which was less a brief and more a philosophical contradiction. And Hannah smiled through the rest of the call and hung up and immediately called Taesung back. What did he do? She said. Not a question. A category. A genre. A recurring feature. He contacted Mr. Kang's office this morning, Taesung said. He offered information. About you. In exchange for a renegotiation of his debt. The specific quality of silence that followed was the kind that is texture, dense and pressurized, the silence of a person who has been surprised not by what someone did, but by the fact that they somehow still had the capacity to be surprised by it. What kind of information? She said flatly. He suggested that Mr. Kang's interest in you was. Taesung paused with the careful neutrality of a man who had been trained to deliver bad news without becoming part of it. Being used. That you were aware of his background before the cafe. That the joke was staged. Hannah closed her eyes. There it was. Kiyosu's one consistent talent, the ability to take a situation he had ruined and find a way to ruin it more completely from a distance, like a man who had burned down a house and then called the fire department to report the smoke. He had offered Jae-ho a fiction dressed in just enough plausible detail to require attention. He had done it not out of malice, precisely, but out of the specific desperation of a man who had run out of other currencies and was now spending ones that weren't his. What did Jae-ho say? She asked. Mr. Kang said he would look into it. She hung up, sat at her desk, looked at the skincare brief still open on her screen, the cursor blinking with the patient indifference of a machine that did not care about any of this. Then she picked up her phone and called Jae-ho. He answered on the first ring this time. "My uncle called you," she said. "Yes." "And told you I staged the cafe?" "Yes." "And you're looking into it?" A pause. "I'm talking to you." That's not an answer. "It is," he said quietly, "if you think about it." She thought about it. He had not, she realized, called Taesung to investigate her history or pull surveillance footage from the cafe or deploy whatever apparatus of verification his world presumably had access to. He had waited for her to call, which meant he had expected her to call, which meant he had already formed a conclusion and was simply waiting for her to confirm it with the fact of her own phone call, because a woman who had staged the encounter would not be the first one to raise it. This was either very intelligent or very trusting, and in Jae-ho's case, she suspected the two were indistinguishable from each other. "He's trying to renegotiate his debt through me," she said. "He thinks my connection to you is leverage." "I know what he thinks." "He's wrong." "I know that too." "The debt stands," she said. It was not a question. "The debt stands," he confirmed. Then, after a pause, "Your uncle has a remarkable talent for creating problems. It's genuinely his only consistent skill," she said. "He's maintained it across 5 decades with no signs of declining performance." She heard something on his end, the slight shift of breath that she had learned to identify as the predecessor to his rare, brief, unguarded laugh. It didn't fully materialize this time, but it was close. "I need to meet with him," Jae-ho said, "to close this properly." "I know. I'd like you to be there." She blinked. "Why?" "Because he used your name to make a move," he said. "You should be present when that move is addressed. It's your right." She thought about this. About the word right, which was another word she hadn't expected from his vocabulary. Not because she thought him incapable of fairness, she was revising that assessment in real time, and had been for weeks, but because fairness in his world presumably operated on different architecture than it did in hers. Except, she was beginning to understand maybe it didn't. Maybe Jae-ho's world, the real one, not the whispered folktale version that made children eat their vegetables, operated on a very rigid internal logic of reciprocity and respect. You honored what you owed. You didn't use people who hadn't agreed to be used. You told the truth before things progressed further. These were not soft values. They were structural ones. Load-bearing. Kyeolsu had violated them. And Jae-ho, she realized, was angry. Not loudly, not demonstratively, but in the specific contained way of a man for whom betrayal of structure was the most serious offense available. "I'll be there," she said. The meeting was Thursday. A private room above one of Jae-ho's legitimate restaurants, the kind of room designed for conversations that required no audience and no record. Hannah arrived first, which she suspected Jae-ho had arranged deliberately, giving her the psychological advantage of an established position when Kyeolsu walked in. He arrived 7 minutes late. Because of course he did. Kyeolsu walked in wearing his optimism-like armor and his house robe-like. Thankfully, he had upgraded to actual clothes, though the expression was the same. He saw Hannah first. Something flickered across his face. Surprise, then recalculation, then the rapid assembly of a new approach, which she recognized the way you recognize a con you've seen performed before, the same moves in slightly different order. Then he saw Jae-ho. The recalculation stopped. Jae-ho was seated at the head of the table with the particular stillness of someone who had decided the outcome of this meeting before it began and was now simply administering it. He gestured to the chair across from him, without speaking. Kyeolsu sat. Hannah sat to the side. She did not look at her uncle. She looked at the table. Jae-ho spoke for 4 minutes. He spoke quietly and without theater, which made it worse. Drama can be argued with, can be escalated against, can be met with matching energy. Quiet is different. Quiet is a wall. He outlined the original arrangement, the debt, the renegotiation attempt, and its implications with the precise, airless efficiency of a man closing a file. Then he said, "You offered something that wasn't yours to offer. Twice." Kyeolsu opened his mouth. "I'm not finished," Jae-ho said. Not loudly. Just finally. He laid out the terms of the debt's resolution, a payment structure that was firm but not punitive, because Jeho, Hannah was learning, was not interested in destruction. He was interested in correction. There was a difference, and it mattered. The matter of your niece, he said, is separate from your debt. It does not belong to you. It never did. You will not reference it, use it, or involve yourself in it again. Kiyosu looked at Hannah. She met his eyes, said nothing.
Did not need to.
He looked away first. After he left, the room was quiet in the particular way of spaces where something has been resolved, not healed, resolved, which is different and more durable. Hannah sat for a moment, looking at the door through which her uncle had disappeared. You were fair to him, she said. He's your family, Jeho said simply. Technically. Technically is still something. She turned to look at him. He was watching her with a quiet attention she was still learning not to find unsettling, not because it felt predatory but because it felt genuine, and genuine attention was, in her experience, rarer and more disorienting than any threat.
Thank you, she said.
For having me here. I told you, he said. It was your right. She nodded slowly, gathered her bag, stood. I have one remaining question, she said. From the list. He waited. The file you kept for 4 years, she said. Did it have a photograph? A pause. No, he said. So you didn't know what I looked like? No, she considered this. A man who had held a name for 4 years with no face attached to it, just the account of a woman who said the wrong things at the wrong times and was somehow worth noting anyway. Who had walked into a cafe prepared for a debt collection and found, instead, something he hadn't budgeted for. Which made 2 of them. Good night, Jeho, she said. Good night, Hannah. She walked out into Seoul's Thursday evening, which was ordinary and indifferent and smelled of rain threatening to return, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could accurately measure, like a person whose life was not happening to her. It was happening with her. The distinction, she thought, was everything. 3 weeks after the meeting with Kiyosu, Hannah's life developed a rhythm she hadn't planned for and couldn't quite name. It wasn't a relationship, not in any form she had previous experience with, not in a way her friends kept hopefully implying with their carefully casual questions and their very unconvincing pretense of not monitoring the situation with the intensity of people tracking a weather system that might destroy their city or bring it rain, depending entirely on variables they couldn't control. It wasn't whatever Kiyosu had imagined when he'd offered her name like a bargaining chip, some transactional arrangement with clear terms and a filing system. It wasn't the dark fairy tale that strangers would have written if they'd known the broad strokes. Ordinary woman, dangerous man, predictable conclusion. It was something without a pre-existing category, which was, Hannah was discovering, both the most inconvenient and most interesting kind of thing. Jeho called on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. Not every Tuesday and Thursday. There were weeks when one or both calls didn't come, when his world presumably required his full and undivided attention in ways that didn't leave room for an hour on the phone with a freelance content strategist who had opinions about everything and the conversational discipline of a person who had never once been successfully interrupted. On those weeks, a message arrived instead.
Short.
Factual.
Occupied this week.
Next Tuesday. No apology, because he wasn't a man who apologized for his life, but also no expectation that she would simply wait in silence, because he wasn't a man who assumed. She found she appreciated this more than she would have appreciated the calls. On the Tuesdays and Thursdays when he did call, they talked for an hour, sometimes longer, about things that had nothing to do with debt arrangements or cafe entrances or the elaborate circumstances of their beginning. He asked about her work with genuine curiosity, not the polite curiosity of someone being a good conversational partner, but the specific curiosity of a person who found systems interesting. And her work, stripped to its architecture, was fundamentally about systems. How people received information, what made them trust a voice or reject it, why certain words landed and others glanced off. He understood this immediately and completely, which made sense when she thought about it. His entire world was built on the same principles, different application, identical foundation. She asked about his. Carefully at first, then less carefully, because he answered carefully regardless of how the question was posed, and she had stopped needing to compensate for a caution he wasn't displaying. He told her about the legitimate businesses first: a logistics company, 2 restaurant groups, a property development firm that had apparently been the most boring thing he had ever done and was also the most profitable, which he delivered with a dry resignation that made her laugh at 11:15 on a Tuesday night loudly enough that Eugen knocked on the wall from the next apartment. He told her about the other parts, more slowly. Not defensively. Not with the rehearsed justifications of a man who needed her to think well of him. She noticed the absence of this specifically because most people, when revealing uncomfortable truths, perform a simultaneous defense without realizing it. Jae-ho simply described his world as it was, the structures that held it, the lines he maintained within it, the things he would not do, and the reasons those lines existed. He spoke about it the way an architect speaks about a building they didn't design but have taken responsibility for maintaining, clear-eyed, precise, not romantic about it. She did not tell him it was fine. She did not tell him it wasn't. She asked questions instead, and he answered them, and somewhere in the accumulated hours of those Tuesday and Thursday evenings, they built something that felt less like the beginning of a relationship and more like the establishment of a language. Private, specific, developed entirely between 2 people who had arrived at it from opposite ends of everything and met somewhere in the middle that neither had expected to find habitable. The dinner happened on a Saturday. Jae-ho chose a restaurant that had prices on the menu, visible, reasonable ones, the kind that didn't require anyone to make peace with their financial situation before ordering, and a private room that managed to feel warm rather than formal, which Hannah suspected had required specific instruction because warmth was not the default setting of spaces associated with him. There were flowers on the table. Not elaborate, architectural flowers arranged by someone with a philosophy about stems, just simple ones, white, in a low vase that didn't obstruct anyone's view of anyone else. She noticed this and said nothing and filed it carefully in the same place she filed all the small deliberate things he did that he never announced. Eugen arrived first, because Eugen always arrived first to situations she considered important. She had once shown up 40 minutes early to a dentist appointment because she wanted, as she put it, to establish psychological dominance over the waiting room. She walked in, looked at the room, looked at the flowers, looked at Jae-ho standing to receive them, and performed in approximately 2 seconds the most rapid and comprehensive assessment Hannah had ever witnessed a human being conduct with their eyes. Sori arrived 30 seconds later, looked at Eugen's face, and immediately understood everything. Jae-ho shook Eugen's hand first. Hannah speaks about you often. She speaks about you constantly, Eugen said, with the precision of someone deploying honesty as a tactical instrument. Though she uses very careful language, which means she's more invested than she's admitting. Hannah looked at the ceiling. I'm aware, Jae-ho said. And the way he said it, not with satisfaction, not with the smugness of a man scoring a point, but with the quiet certainty of someone describing a fact they'd held for a while, made Eugen's expression shift almost imperceptibly. 1 degree. The kind of shift that meant recalibration was occurring. Sori sat down, picked up the menu, noted the visible prices, and said, I like it here already. The dinner lasted 3 hours. Hannah had prepared herself for the controlled diplomacy of 2 worlds being politely introduced, the careful conversation, the measured laughs, the performance of ease that wasn't quite ease. She had not prepared for what actually happened, which was that Eugen, 40 minutes in, leaned forward and said to Jae-ho with absolute directness, Tell me one thing about yourself that isn't managed. The table went briefly quiet. Hannah watched Jae-ho look at Eugen with an expression she recognized, the slight recalibration of a man encountering a person who operated on frequencies he respected. Directness. No performance. The real question beneath the social occasion.
I read, he said.
Excessively. Novels, mostly. I've been told it's inconsistent with my professional image. What kind? Ones where ordinary people survive extraordinary circumstances through stubbornness rather than strategy. A pause. I find them instructive. Eugen looked at Hannah. Hannah looked at her water glass. Sori made a sound that was definitely a laugh disguised as a cough, and the table relaxed into something genuine, not performed ease but actual ease, the kind that only arrives when everyone present has decided, quietly and without announcement, to simply be where they are. Jae-ho asked Yujin about her work. She was an architect, structural engineering, the load-bearing kind, and he asked questions about it with the same specific curiosity he brought to everything, and Hannah watched her oldest friend, the woman who had printed a 14-point document in opposition, explain cantilever design to a Korean crime boss with genuine enthusiasm while he listened with genuine interest and thought, "This is either the strangest thing that has ever happened to me, or it is exactly what was supposed to
Happen.
She was no longer certain those were different things. After dinner, while Sori was in the restroom and Yujin had stepped outside to take a call, Hannah and Jae-ho sat alone at the table for the first time in a room full of the comfortable debris of a good meal, glasses with shallow remains, napkins loosened from their arrangements, the flowers still white and unhurried in their vase. "Well," she said. "Your friends are remarkable," he said. "Yujin asked you a harder question than I did on our first dinner." "Yes." He looked at her. "You asked me to tell you something true." She asked me to prove it. Different methodology. Same instinct. "We've been friends since we were 19, Hannah said. "She knows what I need before I do." "What do you need?" he asked. Quietly. Directly. Without the careful architecture of a man managing an outcome. Just the plain question. She looked at him. At the composed face she had been reading for weeks now, learning its small vocabulary of expressions, the almost laugh, the recalibration, the rare unguarded moment that arrived without announcement and disappeared before you could react to it. She thought about the file kept for 4 years. The deliberate cafe entrance. The business card on the table like a small elegant grenade. The phone call received on the second ring. The car at 7:58. The first dinner. The second dinner. Taesung's careful voice on a Saturday morning. The meeting with Kyeol-soo, and the word right used simply, structurally, like a load-bearing thing. She thought about Tuesday and Thursday evenings, and an almost laugh becoming a real one, and a man who read novels about ordinary people surviving extraordinary circumstances through stubbornness rather than strategy. She thought about what Sori had said. You used to walk around like you were perpetually waiting for the next bad thing. She thought about what it meant that she had stopped. "I need," she said carefully, "for this, whatever this is, to be something I chose. Not something that happened to me because my uncle made a bad bet and fate decided it was funny." He nodded once. And I'm choosing it," she said. "For the record."
Clearly.
Without wine and without reckless declarations made to cafe doors. She met his eyes. "I'm telling you on purpose this time." Something moved across his face. Not the brief, unguarded laugh, not the recalibration, not any of the expressions she had catalogued. Something new. Something she didn't have a word for yet but recognized immediately, the way you recognize music you've never heard but somehow already know. "Then I'll tell you something on purpose," he said. "The cafe, the timing, the entrance, the card, none of it was certain. I knew your name. I knew your reputation. I did not know if you would be interesting. And you called me at 11:30 at night to explain, with 3 analogies, why you weren't interested." The full laugh arrived, real, brief, completely unguarded. "You were interesting." She laughed too, properly, without trying to manage it. The restaurant absorbed the sound warmly. "So we're both admitting," she said, "that this started as a mess. A spectacular one. And we're doing it anyway."
"We are," he said. Simply.
Finally. Like a door closing on everything that came before it and opening onto whatever came next. Yujin returned from her call, looked at the two of them, looked at the table, looked at whatever was visible on Hannah's face that Hannah wasn't monitoring, and sat down with the quiet satisfaction of a structural engineer who has just confirmed that a load-bearing wall is exactly where it needs to be. Sori returned, refilled her glass, and said, "Did we miss something?" "Nothing important," Hannah said. Yujin, who had missed nothing, said nothing, and smiled into her drink. 6 months later, Hannah moved her freelance operation into office space on the 14th floor of a building she initially assumed was just a building. It was Jae-ho informed her when she asked about the lease terms, one of his. He had offered it with the calm matter-of-factness of a man presenting a logical solution to a logistical problem. She had been working from her kitchen table for 3 years. The kitchen table was structurally insufficient for the amount of work she was generating. Here was a solution. "You own the building," she said. "Correct. I'm not taking free office space from you. I'm charging you market rate. You own the market. Adjacent to it," he said. "I'll send the lease." The lease arrived. The rate was fair. She had checked, because she checked everything now, including things that didn't require checking, a habit she had apparently absorbed from the man who scanned every room once and missed nothing. She signed it. She moved in on a Tuesday. The office had a window that looked out over the district, and a desk that was not a kitchen table, and exactly zero evidence that the building's owner had arranged anything specifically for her comfort. Except for a small vase